Stay tuned for tonight's adventure with the Fat Man.
Okay, here we go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I hope it's good to be where you are because I'm really excited to be here today. My name is Baltimore Fats, and this is I See You. Yeah! All right, so we're going to pick it up with the story of the museums, and we're heading to America. Have fun, guys. And so in America, the gatekeepers want the story of museums to start with Charles Willson Peale and his Philadelphia Museum, which he opens in 1784. And so the thing is, this isn't the first museum in America, or even in Philadelphia, for that matter, because in 1784, in Philadelphia, there was a place called the American Museum, which, interestingly enough, Googly fails to mention when I asked for a list of America's earliest museums. And Wiki doesn't include it on their page either, which I think is rather curious, and I have to wonder if that's because the museum belonged to this man, Pierre Eugene du Cimetier, who unfortunately does not have a portrait on record. So for the purpose of this episode, the part of Pierre Eugene du Cimetier will be played by Silas Dean, who had the misfortune of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, as I mistook him for Pierre Cimetier and used this image to make this video. And it wasn't until after I made the video that I realized my mistake. So, my apologies to Silas, but the show must go on. And so, could it be that Wiki and the gatekeepers are elusive around the American Museum because its proprietor was this Pierre Eugene du Cimetier, whose own Wikipedia page does mention the museum? And so Pierre is a Genevan-born naturalist, portrait painter, American patriot, fellow of the American Philosophical Society. How is this? My memory banks are dry as far as Swiss American patriots are concerned. Hey, and, not to mention foreign-born fellows of the American Philosophical Society. And it gets even better because when you actually dig in to the story of Pierre Eugene, it stinks. Starting with his birthplace of Geneva, home of the Geneva Conventions, which established, quote-unquote, humane rules of warfare. Now there's an oxymoron. And, of course, these started in 1864, and it makes me wonder what the influence, the brutality that was happening in America had to do with this first convention. I didn't really follow up on it. And then they do it again in 1949, because they realize that dropping nuclear bombs on people is bad, right? But blowing them up in the sky or in the water or in deserts, that's perfectly fine. Right? CERN is in Geneva with their 666s. They are looking to harness some serious energy with their Large Hadron Collider. And seeing the word large here makes me wonder how many small Hadron Colliders there are, right? Are there medium-sized Hadron Colliders? And so, of course, you never know unless you ask. So I asked, and behold, there are, right? And so the thing about this is who's to say how many of these little particle colliders are out there in the private sector? A privately financed concern could have as many of these as they want and not have to tell anybody. And who knows what these colliders are truly capable of, right? Do you think they're really going to tell Gen Pop that they've tapped into enough energy to recreate the Big Bang, which they say they're trying to do? Right? Or even if these colliders are capable of anything at all. It's not like they're going to admit that the whole thing is a money-grabbing con, right? And then, of course, there's my favorite, that they're trying to open a portal to another dimension, or maybe even to hell, and let in old Saint Nick himself, whose throne apparently sits in Geneva as well. And of course, I'm digressing with all of this, but Geneva has a very rich history, and it's a very interesting place for our boy Pierre to have come from. But what's really interesting to me is that he becomes this renowned American patriot and fellow of the American Philosophical Society almost immediately upon his arrival in America. Or so it seems, right? Because he's allegedly born in 1737. And this would make him a strapping young man of just 31 years old. Awfully young for fellowship in the American Philosophical Society, which is a very private club. Even to this day, it's a very exclusive and very prestigious club, right? But now we have at least 2 foreign-born fellows of the American Philosophical Society creeping around Revolution-era Philadelphia. But it's with Pierre's quick rise to prominence that his story really begins to stink. Because Googly tells me that he left the West Indies in 1763. But I have this encyclopedia entry that says he didn't leave the West Indies until 1765. And so who's wrong here? And then I have this article, which confirms the 1763 date, but says he doesn't move to Philadelphia until 1772. And yet I have another source that says that he doesn't get to Philly until 1774. And so this is 6 years after he's given fellowship into the American Philosophical Society, where he goes on to be one of its curators. How does this happen? Because when you look, history records him as just an itinerant curiosity collector, an eccentric antiquarian with a cabinet of curiosities, a man who frequently bounced between the West Indies and America, collecting things for the better part of 16 years. And he considered all this collecting his purpose. And so the idea of him going back and forth and doing all of this collecting of things, because that's a wealthy man's game, right, in any age. Yet the writer of this article claims that Pierre Eugene was a man of limited private means. Yet he was able to travel around and collect all of this stuff. Everything from books, newspapers, manuscripts, broadsides, prints, fossils, right, coins, right? And history records that Pierre holds the first rare coin auction in America. And so that's kind of interesting, right? He also collects medals, Indian artifacts, rocks, plants, and some animals, right? Mostly just dried insects or preserved reptiles, Everything, of course, stashed in one of these, right? And I'm sure it was lugged across hell and creation by some poorly compensated manservant. But he also compiles chronologies, vocabularies, bibliographies. He even records weather patterns, for crying out loud. Ostensibly doing all of this because he wants to write this all-embracing natural and civil history of the West Indies and North America, which he never writes, of course. But the most interesting thing is that he considers all this collecting he does not only his purpose, but his main occupation. This suggests or implies that this man of limited private means was paid to do all of this collecting. But by who? The writer of this article here just lets this idea drop, and no other source that I read even mentions this aspect, that he considered it a job. But if that's true, then someone was paying him. If there's anything to this idea of a mysterious benefactor, well, that information is most likely lost forever, if it ever existed at all, right? Because who knows how much of any of this history really existed. But what makes this idea really exciting for me is that I can extract a possible clue from his name, Pierre Eugene du Cimetière. Pierre means stone, and Eugene means noble born, which kind of puts an interesting spin on eugenics, if you ask me. Du, of course, means of or from, and cimetière is a misspelling of the French word for cemetery. Are you kidding me? So his name could be roughly translated to mean noble born stone of the cemetery. So he's Tombstone Pete. And this harkens back to the Undertaker, Mary from the Wolfstone place, which is amazing. And while certainly not proof of any sort of complicity between these folk here, right, it is interesting to me that I can connect Tombstone Pete to the Undertaker, and then by association to the goings-on at the Polygon and in the Heart of Darkness, just by their names. We have to keep in mind that most of the people on this map were contemporaries, right? So the benefits of an apophenia that runs wild, right? Because the spelling of cimetière reminds me of scimitar. And scimitars are, of course, swords, right? So his name could also be read as noble-born rock of the sword. Even better is that scimitars are of Eastern origin, used by the likes of the Egyptians and the Ottomans, the Muslim people, which is interesting given the way that Egypt and the Ottoman Empire keep creeping its way into Mud City. especially with their connections to Baltimore. So just trying to translate his name sends up flags that his story is fake. And this gets even more interesting because of how Pierre spends his life once he settles in Philadelphia. Right, whether that's in 1768, 1772, or 1774, once he gets to Philly, he becomes obsessed with the American Revolutionary cause. And he collects anything and everything that had to do with the conflict. And his collection is the richest collection of Revolution-era ephemera known, including dozens of unique copies that would otherwise be unknown. And the bulk of this collection was acquired in one day, when 5 months after his death, in March 1785-ish, the Library Company of Philadelphia, which was a subscription-based library founded by Benny Franks in 1731, they purchased all of Du Semmetier's Revolutionary War memorabilia at auction for £104, which is just over $38,000 today. And it's interesting to me that the purchase is in pounds, because this makes me wonder about the nationality and associations of his administrators, in quotes. Ebenezer Hazard, you gotta love that name, right? And Matthew Clarkson. Could these men have been Du Semmetier's employers looking to recoup some of their investment after his death? Because I don't recall seeing anything about Du Semmetier having children or ever marrying. But we may never know, because unfortunately I just don't have the time to chase down old Ebenezer and Matty Boy. But this bulk purchase by the library company is very reminiscent of that bulk purchase made by the Library of New York in 1935 of letters allegedly written to Alexander Stewart, king of the dry goods salesmen, which again were purchased in one fell swoop. And there are other similarities between these stories, but regardless, all of this makes me wonder just how unique were these copies that would be otherwise unknown. How much of what we understand about the American Revolution today comes from these unique copies? Because one thing is for certain, we may not have ever known what some of the founding fathers looked like were it not for Pierre. Because he's the first guy to paint a portrait of G-dubs. The list of founding fathers that he paints the portraits of is impressive. And it includes Eddie's grandfather, the traitorous Benedict Arnold. And he manages to get all of these portraits while the Revolutionary War is actively happening. And he collects them and ships them off to France to become engravings, which are in turn published in a book. Published where? In London, not far from all this insanity. Right? And it's published in 1783, the very year the Revolutionary War ends. Why are all the earliest known books about the American Revolution that I can find all published in England? It doesn't make sense to me, as discussed in the Born on the 4th of July episode, because America had printing presses. Were they not proud of the achievements that they just accomplished? Again, it boggles my mind that the first books about the American Revolution were published in England. And this little statistic here kind of gives this away, right? Because interestingly enough, this book or portfolio of American Revolutionary heroes sold much better abroad than it did in America, which suggests to me a real push by the London publishers to sell the story of the American Revolution to other countries in Europe and the realm. King George's way of letting them know that America's a new place. And so you don't have to go through us anymore. You go through these guys now. And so it is just insane to me how intimately involved this Pierre Eugene Du Semmetier is in solidifying the story of the American Revolution. And it gets better because not only do the American bigwigs of politics and natural philosophy allow him to paint their portraits and become a fellow of their society, they let this naturalized American via the West Indies, via Switzerland, a man with no history to speak of and who by all accounts was socially awkward, failing to shake his European sensibilities. New World Americans thought that was annoying. Yet the founding fathers give him all of these opportunities and a crack at designing the Great Seal of America. It's him that introduces the Eye of Providence as a symbol for America. And while the founding fathers don't use his full design, they do keep that all-seeing eye. And the most interesting thing about this is that I could find no mention of him being a Freemason anywhere. So how does he get this gig? Why would all of these Freemasons allow an outsider to design their new club's seal? One source alludes to Tombstone Pete's proficiency in the science of heraldry. And so how Du Cimetier becomes this master of heraldry while itinerantly collecting stuff is unclear. But apparently Master Masons and super geniuses like Benny Franks, John Boy, and TJ had little knowledge of heraldry. Yeah, right. but impressed by his portraits and his design for the state seals of Delaware and New Jersey, which are still in use today, they give him a shot and the bigwigs keep the Eye of Providence, which the gatekeepers would have us believe was a conventional symbol for God's benevolence in the 1700s, and not a Masonic symbol until later. Double yeah, right. And so the story of Tombstone Pete winds down with the opening of his American Museum in 1782, which is forced to close after just a couple of years because Du Cimetier was picky about his clientele and priced out any but the wealthy from getting in. And like so many of these characters' stories, though he had powerful wealthy friends, he dies poor and alone. And the contents of his museum is broken up with the library company buying all the American Revolutionary stuff, and it's more probable than not that the rest of it ended up in Charles Wilson Peele's museum that he opens the same year Du Cimetier allegedly dies. And I say allegedly because he's another one of those that they can't produce a resting place or a body for.
How convenient!
Adding more fuel to the fire that his story is a fake. Just like Alexander Stewart, King of the Dry Goods Salesman story was a fake. And so, alright, that's all I have for this one. But unfortunately, I have no idea when there'll be another one. Charlie Peele here has given me quite the knot to untangle, so I'm just going to close this one out with the reminder that just because you don't know the truth doesn't mean you can't have fun with the lies, right? And so, cheers, guys.
I'll see